The Anglo-Scottish Wars, a battle for identity and sovereignty. The Anglo-Scottish Wars, 1296–1513, were a turbulent period of conflict and power struggles between England and Scotland that spanned over 200 years. These wars, rooted in territorial ambitions, national identity and power, were marked by brutality, political intrigue, and a fierce desire for independence and dominance. Scotland and England clashed in a brutal back and forth of sieges, betrayals, and bloody battles that shaped the course of both nations. The roots of the Anglo-Scottish Wars can be traced back to a time when Scotland was fiercely independent, ruled by its own kings, with its own culture and identity. Meanwhile, England had ambitions to expand its influence and control over the British Isles, aiming to bring Scotland under its rule. At the heart of the conflict was a crisis of succession in Scotland. In 1286, the Scottish king Alexander III died unexpectedly, leaving no clear male heir to the throne. The only heir was his young granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. However, Margaret was only a child, and the Scots worried about the stability of the kingdom. To avoid a civil war, the Scottish nobles sought to make Margaret their queen and secure an alliance with England by arranging her marriage to the son of King Edward III of England. But tragedy struck when Margaret died in 1290 before she could reach Scotland. Her death created a power vacuum, and multiple Scottish nobles claimed the throne. In an effort to prevent a civil war, the Scots invited Edward III of England to mediate, not fully realizing his ambition. Edward agreed, but saw this as a chance to assert his control over Scotland. He demanded that each candidate for the Scottish throne recognize him as the feudal overlord of Scotland. This laid the groundwork for over 2 centuries of bloodshed. Edward VI's actions were the spark that ignited the First War of Scottish independence. In 1296, he invaded Scotland, storming through towns and castles, leaving a trail of destruction. His armies captured Berwick-upon-Tweed, a strategic port town, massacring its inhabitants to make a grim example of English power. This invasion marked the beginning of a dark period in Scottish history, as Edward sought to strip Scotland of its sovereignty. In response to English oppression, a fierce resistance emerged. One of the most famous figures of this period was William Wallace, a commoner who became a symbol of Scottish defiance. Wallace led a rebellion, winning a major victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where he and his forces used clever tactics to overcome the larger English army. Wallace's victory at Stirling fueled Scottish pride, but his triumph was short-lived. In 1298, he suffered a brutal defeat at the Battle of Falkirk, where English forces with superior numbers and archers overwhelmed the Scots. Wallace continued his resistance but was eventually captured in 1305. The English executed him in a horrifying display, dragging him through the streets of London before publicly hanging, drawing, and quartering him. His death did not quench the Scottish desire for freedom, but instead stoked the fires of rebellion further. After Wallace's death, another Scottish leader rose to challenge English rule, Robert the Bruce, a noble with his own claim to the throne. Bruce crowned himself King of Scots in 1306, knowing it would provoke Edward. The English king launched a series of invasions to crush Bruce, but Scotland fought back with all its might. One of the pivotal moments in Scottish history came in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn. Bruce's forces, though outnumbered, defeated the English in a staggering victory that became legendary. Bannockburn was not only a military triumph but a symbol of Scotland's resilience. After nearly 20 years of war, the Scots secured a temporary peace with England in 1328 through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, recognizing Scotland's independence. Peace did not last long. In 1332, Edward Balliol, son of a former Scottish king with support from England, sought to claim the Scottish throne. The English-backed invasion launched the Second War of Scottish Independence, with Edward III of England supporting Balliol's claim to weaken Scotland. This period saw a renewed wave of battles and sieges, with Scotland trying to defend its independence against both Balliol and Edward III. The Scots, led by figures such as Sir Andrew Moray and Sir Archibald Douglas, continued to resist fiercely, though the fighting took a heavy toll. In 1357, after years of struggle, the Treaty of Berwick was signed, ending hostilities for a time. Scotland's independence was preserved, but at a high cost. The war had ravaged the Scottish countryside and drained its resources. During the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Anglo-Scottish Wars shifted into a new phase marked by border skirmishes, raids, and feuds. Known as the Border Wars, these conflicts were not as large-scale as the previous wars of independence, but they were equally brutal. On both sides of the Anglo-Scottish border, clans and families engaged in raiding each other's lands, stealing cattle, burning villages, and ambushing rivals. These raids were part of daily life and fueled a bitter rivalry that lasted for generations. Both English and Scottish governments struggled to maintain control over these borderlands, where loyalties often lay more with local clans than with the crown. The final chapter of the Anglo-Scottish Wars came in the early 16th century, when tensions flared once again. In 1513, during the reign of Henry VIII of England, Scotland entered into an alliance with France against England, a pact known as the Auld Alliance. James IV, the Scottish king, saw this as an opportunity to press Scottish claims and marched south to invade England. The result was the Battle of Floden, one of the darkest days in Scottish history. On September 9, 1513, the Scottish army met the English forces near the village of Brankston. The Scots, heavily armored and wielding long pikes, faced English troops equipped with lighter weapons and deadly artillery. The battle was a bloodbath. Outmaneuvered and outgunned, the Scottish forces suffered a devastating defeat, and King James IV was killed along with many of his nobles. Flodden was a national tragedy for Scotland, ending in the loss of its king and much of its leadership. The defeat weakened Scotland's military power, ending any immediate ambitions to conquer English territory. The death of so many Scottish leaders left a power vacuum, and the country entered a period of instability. The Anglo-Scottish Wars left scars on both nations. The conflict fostered a deep-seated mistrust between the English and the Scots, a rivalry that would last for centuries. The wars also had profound social and economic impacts on Scotland, which bore the brunt of the fighting. Entire villages were destroyed, farmlands lay in ruins, and the population was left impoverished. While the wars eventually gave way to a fragile peace, they set the stage for future conflicts, including the political maneuverings that would lead to the union of the crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne. Despite this union, the Anglo-Scottish Wars remained a powerful symbol of Scotland's desire for independence, a dark legacy that echoed through the centuries. In the end, the Anglo-Scottish Wars were not just battles for land or power. They were battles for identity, sovereignty, and pride. The wars painted a grim portrait of a time when nations were forged in blood and sacrifice, and when the determination of a small kingdom resisted the might of a larger empire.